Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Automation Alley webinar that will focus on Michigan's economy as we emerge from the pandemic and the beginning of President Biden's first year in office. It's hard to believe, but here we are, May 13th, and fast approaching the midpoint of 2021. With me today is Paul Taub, Senior Economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and Detroit. Paul, before we get to you, and by way of introduction, my name is Noel Nefshire. I'm Director of International Business Services and Strategic Partnerships for Automation Alley, located in Troy, Michigan. Briefly stated, we were created in 1999. Automation Alley is Michigan's Industry 4.0 Knowledge Center with more than 1,400 members. My roles and responsibilities with Automation Alley include helping small to mid-sized enterprises do business overseas. On the other side of the coin, we also help foreign companies establish their operations here in Michigan, hence the relevance of today's webcast. So Paul, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. In the 15-20 minutes that we have, I'd like to begin by asking you to introduce yourself and also talk about the role of provide an overview about the Federal Reserve Bank, the role and the functions that it plays in the U.S. economy.
So my name is Paul Taub. I work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, out of the branch that's located in Detroit. My title is a senior business economist. My responsibilities include following the Michigan U.S. economy. I do a lot of data gathering for the Federal Reserve. One of the things that the Federal Reserve I think is not widely known is we are, at least on the research side, we have an army of economists. And all of the economists are allowed to have an opinion. So one of the things we do in prepping for like an FOMC meeting, getting Charlie Evans, who's the president of our bank, ready for an FOMC, is share our thoughts on the research that we've done and the information that we've been able to gather through roundtables and calling out to contacts and getting information. So that's a big part of it. I also should state that as we go through this discussion and you asked me a few questions, I'll be making some personal observations. They may not necessarily represent all the views of the FOMC or the Federal Reserve or Charlie Evans, the president of our bank. Again, that's one of the nice things about being at the Fed is we're allowed to have opinions and share those. So again, my responsibilities are collecting data, getting information, having roundtables, those types of things, as they pertain to monetary policy, not necessarily fiscal policy, which is, what's done in Washington.
What year was the Federal Reserve Bank created?
Boy, now you're trying to stretch my mind, but it was back just prior to World War I. I think it was in the early 1900s, 1917 is a number that seems like it rings out to me, but then it was kind of hither and go from there because of, the war and other things. But
right.
It was back in the early 1900s.
Unbelievable. So it's more than 100 years old. I know when we first met, you were explaining the role of the Federal Reserve, and I was really surprised to learn that it's not just a strictly government entity, but kind of a quasi-public-private partnership, for the lack of a better description.
We're giving our mandate from it's a congressional mandate through laws that set up the bank. And the more recent kind of guidelines that we were given is what's called the dual mandate. So we use monetary policy in a way in which to stimulate the economy that creates full employment. So a fully engaged economy would reach full employment, while at the same time, we're responsible for managing inflation. So it's somewhat of a two-edged sword because if we do a real good job at stimulating the economy, then the hope is we create inflation, which would then cause us maybe to pull back on some of our accommodativeness of monetary policy.
Right. So in the last year and a half, ever since COVID became a huge part of our vernacular, what have we learned from the pandemic outbreak, if anything?
Well, one of the things I learned is really how fragile the U.S. economy is, especially our workforce. This is a major disruption that hit the economy. When we were going through the Great Depression, or recession, back in 2008, I would get a lot of questions of, will the next recession be like this? And I was always saying, no, it's not. It's not going to be anything as severe as this. The financial crises are kind of very rare things. There was a lot of legislation that was passed, a lot of rules that were put into place to try to protect us from a financial crisis again in the future. And I think I was partially right that this isn't going to be like that last recession. It's going to be entirely different, what we're coming out of, and the problems and the issues that have arisen from this pandemic are going to be difficult, I think, to address. The economy is, of course, bouncing back much more quickly than a lot of people thought. The financial crisis took years for us to dig out of that hole. A lot of regulations that were put into place, some of those have been pulled off in recent years. And it took a long time to get the employment back to what we would call full employment, which actually we had unemployment rates prior to the pandemic of 3.5% range, which we hadn't seen in decades. However, the pandemic has kind of posed new questions for us that we need to answer. And one of the big ones is, how do we protect our workforce? The workforce is so vital for this country to keep operating at its full capacity. And how do we put protections in place for them, as well as protecting businesses and their ability to find and recruit new talent, which has become paramount coming out of this pandemic, is trying to find enough people for the job openings that are being created.
Right. And we're still experiencing that same issue. In my sense, it'll continue to be a challenge for the foreseeable future. But that said, in addition to the global economy, who are this year's winners and losers thus far by industry as a result of us sort of emerging from the pandemic? Not to mention, having experienced it as well. Because I mean, like PPE, medical, they're doing quite well. But I just wonder if you could take a stab at that question.
Sure. When you're going from the consumer side, which I will address it basically by sector, the goods producing side of the economy is doing quite well, both durable and non-durable goods. People have found themselves staying at home. And right off the bat, we did real well in home entertainment, furniture, office furniture, those types of things that were required for people to set up their offices. And those were durable and both non-durable goods. And the durable side, the auto industry actually bounced back so much faster than a lot of people thought. When the pandemic first started, it was believed that the auto industry, I know some had seen some of the early projections for 2021, we're in the 15 million range, and we've seen sales now hovering around 17 million for the last couple of months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's sort of a great lead in to my next question, is how supply chain shortages will continue to impact the automotive industry. And as we've seen, with the shortage of semiconductors and rare earth materials for electric vehicles, car companies are really being challenged. And, there's going to be precipitous fall in car sales this year as they wait for semiconductors. I know that there was an article, one automotive manufacturer had 1.2 million cars parked on lots because they didn't have the chips required to push them off the end of the production line.
Yeah, I think there's the two-edged sword of the strong bounce back in the auto industry, because I think most analysts and a lot of purchasing managers for auto companies, they cut back on some of their demand and cut back on some of their orders for some of these things, some of the parts that go into producing vehicles, one of which were computer chips. And as I pointed out earlier, people staying from home electronics items became very popular. And so a lot of the home electronics companies took the opportunity to buy up this excess supply because price and supply and demand. And so when the auto companies did come back, the supply wasn't there. It was already being used up by home electronics, televisions, all those kinds of items.
Right. Yeah, I know that those are interesting observations, but one thing I do want to circle back to, you talked about how the pandemic has underscored how fragile our economy as well as the world economy is. But on the other hand, it also showed how resilient we are. So I guess there's really two lessons to be learned, given how quickly we are in fact recovering from the COVID. I mean, it's some places better than others, certainly, but we're certainly fortunate to, be the recipient of the vaccine, and how well it's been distributed. Obviously, there are some hiccups at the very beginning, but my God, you look at these other countries, Mexico and India are a case in point, and they're still grappling with, with oxygen, vaccine supplies, and medical supplies to combat the virus. So, but there is obviously a concern about supply chain shortages, not going away, because just take chips. I mean, 80% of those are produced in Taiwan. And, obviously Intel's trying to address it by opening up a fab lab in Arizona. But I mean, those chips aren't going to be online for like another few years if we're lucky. So anyway, but certainly, the supply chains aren't just, fragile, as you suggested, but extremely vulnerable, especially with just-in-time delivery mandates and lean manufacturing. I think you're seeing sort of the downside to that, because I mean, before companies would stock parts in the event of a black swan or a gray rhino event, but they're running lean and mean, and some of the theories behind lean manufacture are sort of coming back to haunt them, particularly in the automotive industry. So can we talk a little bit about the U.S. trade conflict and how it's going to continue to affect not just the U.S. economy, but the world economy? It just seems as though it's intractable. It's not going away anytime soon. But what are your thoughts?
Well, that's a great question. And what remains to be seen how the trade problem works itself out. I'm not a trade expert, but
Sure.
I do know that we can't take it on alone. Goods are now out of China are now starting to create some inflationary pressures themselves, but most of that's because of the transportation, trucking, the logistics issues, ships coming into ports fully loaded, and they got to get back to China. They're leaving empty. So those are a lot of that those supply disruptions, but also the logistics issues. But I think the U.S. hopefully the approach of using tariffs obviously isn't going to work. In fact, I think some of the issues that we're seeing with higher costs is the ultimate what everyone expected was going to happen with the tariffs, that finally they're passing these costs on to consumers. Everyone knew there would be a lag in doing that as companies tried to plan that out. So I think we need to start thinking about how we address the unfair trade practices that have been taking place with China or from China, but we can't do it alone. We need to do it in an effort with others, with our other allies and other people that have a vested interest in the region.
Sure.
Other countries that don't want to be held hostage by bad practices, and at some points be hurt by them because they're being kind of the waterfall effect. So I think we need to address the issues, but I think we need to do it in a very thought out manner. We need to work with others countries that agree with the way we work in the United States, that are more capitalistic, free market oriented type countries, and address the issues with China as they come up. I just don't think we can do it alone.
No, I agree. It's going to be a concerted effort without a doubt. And it seems like in that regard, the European Union has decided to sort of go their own way with their, with their China policy that, is a slight departure from the U.S. In particular, you have France and you have Germany. So, yeah, I think that China, we talked about how, how trade tariffs, they don't work, and how consumers are held hostage to it. It sort of reminds me, though, of the Stockholm syndrome, where I think a lot of countries around the world, especially those that are beneficiaries of the Belt and Road investment spending coming from Beijing, are fear getting that funding abruptly cut off by China because they depend on it for economic development. So And then, of course, another big concern too is that, there's a lot of saber rattling in the South China Sea. And people don't realize that, we certainly don't want a conflict to break out there, because 3 trillion of global trade annually goes through the South China Sea. And so, if you just broaden the focus a little bit and look at President Xi, one of his huge objectives is that he wants Taiwan to come back into the mainland China fold, and he might risk military conflict. And we see war games and Chinese jet fighters, incurring, they're intruding on Taiwanese airspace to sort of maybe soften up their defenses a little bit for the real thing. And then, another concern is U.S. strategic ambiguity toward Taiwan that might, cause somebody to make a miscalculation. And so, there's just so many geopolitical concerns that factor into, into the trade conflict that we have, not just with China, but, all countries of the world. So anyway, well, what's really of interest, I know it's in your bailiwick, but, everybody's been concerned about, fiscal or stimulus spending, and its influence on inflation and interest rates. And I think that it sort of got real this week. We saw the stock market sort of tank a little bit as a result of concerns about the interest rates. I'm sorry, about inflation and the impending rise in interest rates. Can you talk about that at all?
Well, I think part of the stock market worry too is what was going on in the Middle East with Israel,
Right.
and the war that looks like it's erupting there. So it's not restricted to just to the Pacific area. There's conflicts everywhere, and also as we start pulling troops out of Afghanistan, the concerns about that. So I think the market was kind of rattled on that. But the increase in CPI index was quite notable. It was up, if you look at all items, was up about 4.2%. You take out food and energy, it was up about 3%. But a lot remain. I mean, we don't know. One data point does not make a trend. However, we knew prices were starting to rise because we were starting to see, as we talked about, the difficulty in getting chips. Another area that we didn't talk about was the housing market, and an area that did quite well. And the price of lumber, a 2x4 used to be $7, is now $10. Plywood has gone up.
Incredible.
All these things are having inflationary pressures. Now, one could argue that it's related to the fiscal stimulus money that's out there. A lot of people got money. I mean, look at ourselves. We're both working. I never missed a day's work. Yet I got a fiscal stimulus check. And so maybe there could have been a better job on targeting how that money was sent out. But the whole concept was to try to keep the economy moving, try to keep people employed, at least those that are employed, keep them working, put food on the table. And the housing market has just taken off. People are finding maybe they don't want to live in a congested city, and they're moving to the out to the suburbs, and they're trying to get away from the congestion. Home prices have gone up. The FHFA increase in February was 12.2% on a year-over-year basis. And so those are all kind of inflationary items. But it remains to be seen if those are structural changes to the economy or if they're transitory. And the Fed is still trying to gather that information on that. I know when I talk to a lot of business leaders, they're quite adamant that it's some kind of structural change that could take off and be uncontrollable. Because a lot of people remember the 1980s, and we had stagflation, and we had high unemployment and high inflation at the same time.
Those days.
I don't know that at this point we can say that's where we're headed. It seems more difficult to say, because there is such a growth in overall global capacity in China and India and other countries coming on stream that are going to continue to provide capacity to build things, goods, that can be sold around the world. So that remains to be seen. However, as I point out, we do monetary policy and not fiscal policy. But when you talk about interest rates, in any free market economy, there bonds or in all economies, bonds are really the interest rate you pay on a bond is a function of supply and demand. If you have a fixed rate security, whatever it's growing at, the way that interest rate changes is by what someone's willing to pay for it. So for example, if I had a fixed rate bond that I'm going to offer for 10%, this is just a high school example, but I would sell it for $900 and we'd mature in a year and I'd give you $1,000, and except for rounding errors, it's pretty close to a 10% return, right? So if someone else wants that bond more than I do, they may be willing to pay $950 for it. And all of a sudden that interest rate falls to 5%, or somebody wants it more than they do. I mean, so that's one of the things about the US Treasuries and US securities. We've never defaulted on a loan. We've always made our interest payments, and they're highly sought after all over the world. And so because of that, we've been able to pretty much sell all the debt that we've offered up in public. In fact, the 10-year Treasury yesterday, even after the fall of the market and the high announcement of the high inflation rates, was still trading at 1.69%. So now is really the time to borrow money in a lot of aspects. You would think if you're a large government, why weren't we doing this sooner to fix our infrastructure, to shore up our education system?
I agree with you.
That we need to do, not only invest in physical capital, but we need to invest in human capital. We need to have a K through 12 and pre-K now. Everyone recognizes that a young adult, a young child that goes to something prior to kindergarten, does some kind of preschooling, is a lot more likely to finish high school and be successful. And so investing in those things, I think, will have benefits in the long run that will more than pay for any interest that we may end up paying on the bonds. So I'm very supportive of those things. I think that now's the time to do it. Let's say we do borrow $1 trillion at 5% and inflation goes to 6%. You're paying the money back at negative interest rates.
Right.
So I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen. I don't have a magic ball to say where interest rates are going to go, but I do think that we're missing a golden opportunity here to invest in this country if we don't take advantage of these low interest rates now.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I know the new monetary policy has been kind of fashionable in the last year or so, but is that really the key? As long as inflation is able to adjust accordingly, or the interest rate?
Yeah.
What is?
So you're talking about modern, what's called modern
monetary policy. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's what you alluded to a moment ago.
Well, the theory of modern monetary theory is that a sovereign nation that prints its own fiat currency does not have to worry about borrowing money. They just print more currency.
Yes, there you go. Yeah,
I think a lot of economists don't necessarily agree with that. I think there is some point in time which you could saturate even the global economy with too much debt, in which case, as I pointed out earlier, there's not enough appetite to buy it all up, and so you have to discount the prices to get whatever money you can, and that's when interest rates start to rise. So I don't know what that number is. I don't know that anyone does know what it is, but at this point, I think there's plenty of appetite for US securities and treasuries out there in the global market. As I pointed out, we're still getting under 1.7% for a US Treasury bill as of yesterday. And I think that at this point in time, it's too early to tell if that appetite has been filled.
So for the remainder of the year, are you you always come across to me and that's why I like you, as an eternal optimist. So what's it going to be for the rest of the year? Is it going to be bullish, bearish, or somewhere in between?
Well, I think the economy is going to continue to come back. I mean, the current forecast right now, if for this last quarter, we had 6.1% growth in Q1. The Blue
Right.
Chip has over 9% for Q2. And it starts to settle down, and it's still above 2% through the end of 2022. Our long-term potential for this country is closer to 2%. So you're looking at economic growth above potential.
Sure.
Potential is calculated based on growth in labor plus productivity. One of the things I think that is an issue that we're not paying enough attention to, or at least is being lost in all the smoke around the heavy fiscal policy, is what's going on with our labor force. Is that we have a maturing labor force that is aging quite rapidly. If you look at it by group, by age group, if you look at the 16 to 24 and the 25 to 55, that's actually expected to shrink over the next decade.
Sure.
That's the sweet spot for where a lot of businesses are looking to hire. And when you look at people over 65, that's going to grow. In fact, the projections by the BEA for labor force growth over 75 is over 12%. So we are an aging population, and I think we need to take that into consideration. That could be inflationary, just trying to bring people back into the labor force on its own right.
Oh, you're not kidding, because I mean, we fight the battle every day with the, especially with the baby boomers, beginning to retire, because when they retire, they also take their skills and knowledge with them. And, there's no Pez dispenser that pops up, somebody with their same talent to be able to take over, once they leave their jobs. So, and, they're talking about that too. We were just referencing China a moment ago, but China is having the same problem. I mean, with their aging workforce.
Yeah, it's unbelievable that it's actually some forecasts are that China lost population in the last 2 years.
Yeah,
That's but see, that's where I go back to now. I don't think we can wait any longer to invest in this country in a way in which we make ourselves more competitive globally. We've got an infrastructure that, depending on who you talk to, the Army Corps of Engineers, I think the best state was Utah at a C+ or a C. Nationally, the infrastructure in this country is rated around a D. Some areas worse. There's bridges falling down. There's an opportunity to put people to work and create jobs and invest in this country's future. And I add to that the importance of investing in education. When you and I went to college, if you went to a school in Michigan, roughly 75% of your tuition was paid for by the state.
Right.
Today, that number is closer to 25%. So this a lot of talk about while costs are rising in colleges, a lot of that cost is now being passed on to the student, where before that was being paid for by the state. And that created a knowledgeable workforce that allowed us to move into the 21st century or into the late 20th century to develop computers, software, technology that put us in front of the world. That would be a shame to lose if we allow that to get away from us.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's a sad commentary on the infrastructure and how much work needs to be done. But you know what? We've seen this one coming for like around 20, 30 years. It's just that sometimes when we think of infrastructure, we don't really see it because a lot of it's underground with, sewage and wastewater disposal. But, we see it every winter, certainly here in Michigan, when we get that freeze-thaw cycle. But, people just look at the roads and think that's what infrastructure is. But it also includes, bridges, railways, airports, and for that matter, 5G. So, yeah, but
you need it. And that goes too also with the aging population. I always say it's hard for me to believe that 25 years ago, we didn't know that somebody that was 40 was going to turn 65 today.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it funny? I mean, you see it coming, but yet, you don't do anything about it until it's too late. I mean, that's kind of I think it's not just the nature of government, business, and industry. I just think that's a function of human nature. But one of the things, though, this might be a subject for another time, but I did want to give a nod to immigration. I think, the best way to address our aging population and them retiring is to, have immigration reform. I mean, this is ridiculous how, both parties have sort of gone back and forth, on creating some, immigration reform, particularly as it relates to the dreamers.
Right.
And, if you want to, find, the best solution to cure what ails us, immigration is where it starts. I mean,
I agree. I don't think we're gonna birth our way out of this. I think
no.
that we're pretty much stuck there. So a good comprehensive immigration policy is long overdue in this country.
For sure.
And maybe to correct some of the ills that we're partially responsible for some of the things we did in the 50s and such in South America and such, that created an environment for people. You don't want to cut the spending to countries that are impoverished. Those people are suffering enough as it is, and we cut resources to these countries, and then you wonder why they're in such turmoil.
Yeah, right.
And they want to get out of these areas and try to get to the United States. We've always been welcoming of immigrants. That's how we set ourselves up. So I think we can do a better job than we're doing now.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's where foreign aid, a lot of Americans tend to overlook the positive impacts of foreign aid because, we continue to invest in Latin American markets. The problems of, governance and poverty, would have been improved rather than winding up on our doorstep, literally and figuratively, as we see today. I mean, if I'm living in a country that doesn't afford me protection, safety, and good quality of life, I might be tempted to go to a country illegally. And I'm not trying to make an excuse. I mean, not trying to make excuse, but they have to worry about themselves and more importantly, their
Well, they got to
families
worry
too.
about their children. Everyone's.
Yeah.
I mean, the concept of the American dream was that your children stand on your shoulders, and their children stand on their shoulders, and everyone lifts the next generation up. And that's something that's being lost today in the way in which we're addressing some of these issues. And that again, that's why I say I think now's the time to do that investment. It'll pay dividends in the future. A lot of people don't want to spend their money today, but I think the U.S. has been very good at being a benevolent society that takes care of its own and reaches out to others when they can. And I think we need to bring some of those ideals back.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. So you and I should write a book. Well, Paul, I want to thank you very much for being with us today and providing us with your firsthand knowledge about the economy, and not to mention your insights on what we can expect for the remainder of 2021. So we're looking forward to inviting you back for another midterm report. But in the meantime, we really appreciate your friendship to Automation Alley and me personally, and we'll look forward to talking to you down the road shortly.
Okay, real good. I look forward to hearing from you soon. And thank you again so much for letting me participate.